Okay, so today I want to throw my hat in an already overcrowded ring and talk about Helldivers 2. I've seen a lot of people talking about Helldivers difficulty, overall balancing. There's a lot of outrage to the point that they put out a community statement yesterday assuring us that within the next 60 days they're going to be redefining their approach to balancing and like reassessing everything. And that's great, but I think that there's a dangerous path that we could be headed down here, which is why I'm making this video. I'm largely going to be responding to the issues and proposed solutions raised by the YouTuber Reginald in his latest video, which I will link in the description. This video is probably the most concise, earnest, and least rage-baity of the ones that I've seen, and the feedback expressed in his video seems to be pretty representative of the community as a whole, but in a clearer, less bitchy way. That being said, I still have some problems with it. A common point of frustration in the Helldivers community right now is weapon balancing, and a lot of players feel that primary weapons are just too weak on the whole, with certain targets like Berserkers, Brood Alphas, etc. taking large portions of most magazines to take down. And the solution proposed by Reginald and many other players is to just blanket buff primary weapons and bump their damage up. And to a certain extent, buffs like this would probably be fine, but he also proposes bringing back fragmentation to the Eruptor and buffing AoE damage in general, making it more readily available by increasing the crossbow's AoE, and presumably this would go for the Purifier and Plasma Punisher as well. And again, those changes seem to address the problem with those weapons, but in combination I think this would hurt the balance long term. And the issue here is that in order to have any actual impact on TTK versus bigger targets, the damage buffs for primaries have to be significant, but this runs the risk of trivializing any light enemies that already aren't very particularly resilient. And I don't want to waste anyone's time, so I'm just going to come out and say right now what my preferred fix would be, and then I'll give you my reasoning later. I think that rather than buffing our power levels, it makes far more sense to nerf down the enemy's power. And this might seem like I'm just playing semantics, but there is a pretty big difference when it comes to steering the future of the game and avoiding power creep. As I said before, light targets are already easily dispatched. It's mainly just problem targets like Brood Alphas that are an issue, and it makes much more sense to just tweak those problematic targets and bring them in line than it does to just blanket buff everything that we have. My reasoning is that buffing our power levels too much is directly at odds with the other suggestions of adding interesting and varied content to the game. So, in his video, Reginald makes the point that he'd like to see more interesting and threatening lightly armoured targets, and change the distribution of enemies to include less heavily armoured targets, and make stealth a real mechanically supported playstyle. And it might not be immediately obvious how these are contradicted by the buffing our power level thing, so let me explain. The idea of adding more interesting and varied light enemies is great, but primaries already deal with the majority of light enemies very efficiently, and even the pistols only take a couple of headshots to dispatch stuff like Terminid Warriors, for example. And if AoE was readily available and powerful, and the heavy enemies were far rarer on top of being easier to kill, what would be the point in bringing standard non-AoE primaries? You can look at a game like Warframe to see this brought to the extreme, where in that game AoE is king, and you can have as much single target damage on your fucking Vectis Prime, which is a sniper rifle for those who don't play Warframe. You can have as much single target damage, you can have as much crit as you'd like, but it doesn't change the fact that it's not going to be wiping rooms when you fire, and it feels as though DE have backed themselves into a corner with the balancing of the game, to the point that in order to make things like snipers appealing, they've just started adding AoE snipers, which kind of defeats the point. But anyway, back to Helldivers. The only real argument in favour of single target weapons would be to take out larger targets and take advantage of their armor penetration, but AoE weapons can also deal with these targets due to damage, stagger. They have, AoE splash damage, which quite often goes through the armor of something like a regular Scout Strider. And due to the AoE, they'll kill nearby trash mobs too. This could easily create an environment in which designing light enemies that will actually be relevant threats is far more difficult. as pretty much anything that's melee oriented will be wiped out by AoE along with the existing enemy mobs, and any enemies that attack at range don't require as much precision to deal with because you can just lob AoEs in their general direction. Whereas single target weaponry requires you to stop and aim, or like risk missing a bunch of shots. The easiest and most likely route that the devs would go to make new enemies threatening is to just make them stronger, give them bigger health pools, perhaps add more armor so they're not even lightly armored at this point. And that just puts us back where we started, but with some added power creep. And this would also gut the whole make stealth real idea entirely, because any time spent making silenced weapons, which is one of Reginald's suggestions, and dedicated stealth mechanics is completely wasted, because they're mechanics that 99% of people aren't going to engage in. This is already kind of the case, because as he says in his video, most people just want to be able to approach this game by fighting constantly, and a lot of the complaints are about the way that the game makes this more difficult. Making us stronger across the board just exasperates this problem. I'm in favour of the general make stealth real suggestion, including the idea of delaying call-ins and making them easier to stop in time, as well as fixing a lot of the janky interactions the stealth has with the AI, but realistically, these are going to take a lot of effort, and if people aren't going to be using stealth because combat is easier as a whole, because our power levels have buffed up, then no one's going to be doing stealth, because people want to do combat. In order for stealth to be a real option, there needs to be a reason to use it. There needs to be overwhelming threats that make us weigh the scales between full stealth, small quiet engagements, and open combat. And if our power levels are too high, then no one is going to do anything other than open combat. It's easier to stop patrols. There's less heavily armored targets, meaning you don't need to dedicate your support weapon slot to bringing anti-tank a lot of the time. You know, you can just fight, because AoE is like readily available and powerful, targets go down much easier, and no backup is being called, or at least not as often. And I don't think that that is the direction to take it. I agree with the make stealth real suggestion, but most gamers are going to pick the most immediately fun surface level option, which is to just blast things and make explosions. And that's not as though the majority of the player base is doing something wrong. It's only natural that in a game where you can slay out and kill a bunch of bugs, that a lot of people are going to want to slay out and kill a bunch of bugs. It's just that the game is trying to create a delicate balance between allowing us to have a power fantasy and also making us think tactically and be forced to coordinate. And at the moment, a lot of people seem to be unaware of that balance. They want the game to just go towards one side, which was going to hurt the long-term health of the game. Because it doesn't matter how surface level fun it is, it doesn't matter how many bugs you can go out and kill, you're going to get burnt out. And this is the main problem, is that the game isn't too difficult. I mean, maybe it is in some ways, but that's not your problem with it. If you're not having fun, it's not because the game is too difficult, it's because you're most likely just burnt out. You've been playing largely the same mission types, against largely the same enemies, in largely the same way, for months, and it's no surprise that you'll get burnt out in that kind of situation. It's completely normal and healthy to want to take a break from the game, and it's not a sign of the game being fundamentally broken. It's just a natural result of putting a hefty chunk of time into something in a fairly short time span. And this exact same thing happens with every live service game or major multiplayer release. Suggestions provided don't do anything to combat burnout or make the game more engaging in a meaningful way, and if they do, then they contradict those ways. These are just short-term ways of making things more fun, but that fun isn't going to last. Even with significant changes to the gameplay formula, if you're playing at this pace, you will get burnt out. It's almost inevitable. And this game has a smaller studio, smaller dev team. The rate at which they can put out content is not going to match the rate at which you can burn through that content. You see it with MMOs, you see it with something like Destiny 2. An expansion comes out and people have already cleared like everything that it added within like a day. And that's not a problem with, oh well, the expansion didn't add enough content, because that's a problem with, I have done nothing but play this game since it came out, and you just burn through it. Like, the time investment for developers to make content versus the time investment it takes for us to get through that content is so wildly disproportionately matched. It takes so much longer to make something that is going to be a 50-minute mission or something like that. Like, that takes, God, I don't even know, countless hours. It highly depends. Game development is a fucking complicated thing. And to be fair, I'm not just blaming the player base here. Like, this isn't helped by the fact that this is a repetitive game by nature, and new enemies and tools for the players and environments and objectives are all drip-fed to us to coincide with in-game story moments and also provide time for the team to, like, actually make this content. And that adds to the burnout problem, because it's taking a while to get 1 or 2 new missions, and then they come out and people have just, you know, you've done them. Once you've run a mission, like, you know, 4 or 5 times, you know exactly how it works. And you're not, like, it's not exciting to a lot of people anymore. Personally, I think a major issue for the community when it came to the Escalation of Freedom update was a complete lack of new major objectives. There's technically the Kill the Impaler major objective, but I'm not really going to count that one, and I'm sure most people don't. Since launch, there's been quite a few major additional objectives, but they've launched one at a time, and a lot of them have been limited to specific major orders, such as the TCS missions and Dark Fluid deployment, and some of them are limited to defense campaigns, such as Personnel Extraction, which is no longer in the game to be rebalanced, and the Generator defense mission. And all the other ones are still released one at a time, whilst higher difficulty operations are 3 missions long. So in order to do the new content that people are excited about, they also have to sign up to do 2 older missions that they've done countless times before and are likely sick of. And you could just say, well, those people should take a break, but I think this kind of ignores the underlying problem here, which is that Arrowhead could do themselves a massive favour by holding off a little bit longer and releasing 2 or 3 major objectives at a time, injecting a decent amount of variety to the game rather than just tiny drops. In a similar vein, the release of Escalation of Freedom would have been a perfect time to release a new free warband, filled with more miscellaneous, less precisely themed items. So, premium warbands are pretty tightly themed, at least nowadays, with the jungle warband and the flame-themed warband all including items that are pretty much exclusively fitting in that theme. Whereas the older warbands had a kind of loose theme, and then you'd often get some items that were just kind of there, such as the Adjudicator assault rifle and the pistol, I forget the name of it, I think it's the Verdict. Those weapons aren't really tied to the theme of the battle pass in which they come from. They probably could have just been fit into a more miscellaneous military hardware themed free warband like what we had at the launch of the game. And I understand that maybe, you know, this is going to come across as me going, oh, well, I don't want to buy a warband, just give me stuff for free. And it's like, that's not really the point. The point is that, like, this is a major update, supposed to be the biggest update the game has ever seen as of right now, and yet the premium warband came out 2 days later, not on the actual launch date of the update. So the on-the-day experience for a lot of people is kind of just like, oh, well, maybe I'll just wait 2 days and get the new weapons and then try it all out. And also, it would have been the perfect time to have, like, you know, another free battle pass to work through. And maybe you disagree with that. I also understand that this would require them to actually create the things to go in this battle pass, and as I said before, creating things takes time. I realize that perhaps that's like an unfair expectation, but I think delaying the release of the update like a couple months maybe to give themselves time to make it like a more expansion-esque moment would have probably really helped with the reception that the community had for the update. But realistically, this is a live service game, and I'm sure they're under pretty strict schedules, especially under Sony's management. But in my mind, I think it would have really helped. Okay, enough about Burnout. Let's talk about just overall balance again. Let's talk about how I think balancing the balancing approach could be adjusted, and what I think the problems with it are. So the big one is nerfing flamers 2 days before the fire-themed warband. I understand the desire to not want the primary and secondary flamers to be able to kill charges, and the reason flames were nerfed as a whole was to make it so that the primary and secondary couldn't kill charges. This is all but confirmed in the new community statement, where they mentioned that they're gonna re-look at the flamethrower, but they can't just revert it because that would break other things. And I guarantee you that the other things that would be broken are absolutely the fact that the pistol flamethrower and the primary flamethrower work off the exact same framework and would be capable of killing charges. And I understand that. I understand the desire to not want them to be able to do that, but I would have highly preferred a delay in getting the warband in order to make them work via a different system, rather than just nerfing the one that we already had. It's not as though the flamethrower was insta-killing charges, and frankly, even if it was, with the sheer volume that are spawning in difficulty 10, who cares if you're insta-killing a charger? There are fucking dozens of them, you know? And the way I see it, the HP pools that those larger foes have, the Behemoth charges, the Bile Times, the Brood Alphas, Factory Striders, fucking Devastators, you know, whatever, Berserkers, I'm fine with them being tanky, but they spawn in very large groups to the point that on high difficulties, it can be really overwhelming. And that is the point of high difficulty. But a lot of the player base is too overwhelmed. And you can't fairly just say, well, don't play on high difficulty then. Because in order to experience the new content, in order to see the new enemies, in order to visit the fortresses for the bots and the huge outposts, like the huge nests for the bugs, you have to play on the high difficulties. It's all well and good to say, well, you don't need to play on the high difficulties to get super samples anymore because they spawn on a lower one now. And it's like, yeah, but you want to see the new enemies, you want to see the new content. You are going to have to dip your toes into the high difficulty. And while personally, I really like high difficulty, I pretty much exclusively play on D9 and now D10, now that this is out. But the thing is, the majority of the player base either struggles really heavily to do that, or doesn't find it fun, even if they are doing it. So there needs to be a solution. And I think you could just tweak the spawns, you could just tweak the enemy's health, sure, but then that risks ruining the balance, the delicate balance that I talked about before, where you have to have the enemy be enough of an overwhelming threat to make you want to consider stealth, to make you want to consider avoiding engagements and coordinating with each other, work as a team, to actually be a unit. And it's to try and make open combat feel like a mistake sometimes. Sometimes you want to avoid open combat, but if open combat is always a mistake, then people feel like they're being punished for using their weapons. They feel like they're being punished for playing the way that they want to play. And while usually my elitist response would be, well, I don't care how you want to play, you should play how the game wants you to play, the fact of the matter is that this is a live service game which needs players in order to survive, and also those players can't exactly get the experience that they want on lower difficulties either. And I think there is a solution that can provide both contingents of the player base with what they want. So, personally, I already said that I think the next logical step is to lower the HP of problematic targets. But I also said that I like combat being super overwhelming at the high difficulty. And I also said that I think it's unfair that new enemies and fortresses and so on only spawn on the higher difficulty tiers, or at least spawn far more frequently there. And the solution, which may or may not be realistic, I don't know how big of a deal this would be to implement, I don't know the intricacies of Arrowhead's engine, I don't know. But I personally think that a lot of these worries, a lot of this stress could be avoided by introducing a damage difficulty scaler. So what I have in mind is scaling enemies' health by what difficulty you're on. You could scale their damage with what difficulty you're on. Like, either both of those, or even just the first one. Make it so that on the lower difficulties, or even, hell, create an entirely new difficulty, but tweak the other ones to have a lower scaling, like a lower health and lower damage, to make it so that people who want to just slay out and experience the game can see those new enemies, can see the new content in that difficulty bracket, and then when they're ready, or maybe never, because maybe they don't want to, move up to the higher one. I'm fine with the highest difficulties be existing just for bragging rights. Like, I don't think tying rewards to the highest difficulty, like tying exclusive rewards to that, is a good idea with the game in the state that it's in right now, because either you need to significantly rework the entire game, which would ruin the fun for the people who really like it as it is, and even then, there are still going to be people who just don't want to do those high difficulties. I think tying certain rewards, like if it's just cosmetics or titles or whatever, like a lot of other games do this. A lot of other games do tie rewards to difficulty for bragging rights, and that's good, that's fine. But the things with Helldivers is that the rewards are not just for bragging rights. The rewards are, well, do I need to do 1 million of these lower difficulty missions, or can I do a couple of higher difficulty ones and get enough samples? Or, you know, fucking, do I even get to see the enemies that have been added to the game? And if you don't play on the high difficulties, the answer is no. So either change it, make it so that high difficulty is exclusively for bragging rights, or, as I'm suggesting, have a scaling algorithm that allows the lower difficulties to have these new enemies, these heavier enemies, and make them so that they're not quite as overwhelming. Have Brood Alphas show up earlier, have fucking whatever. It doesn't matter. You get the point that I'm trying to make here. Like, and again, I don't know how realistic this is. I would happily settle for just HP tweaks. And to be honest, I'm fine with the game as it is right now. Sans flamethrower nerf. I'm happy. I like the overwhelming threat. But a lot of people don't. And if a lot of people don't, then there probably is a problem. I just don't think that buffing us on the whole is the solution to that problem. I don't think creating power creep is the solution to that problem. So, hopefully, you understood where I'm coming from, you understood what I'm trying to get across. Even if you disagree, I hope you at least get my meaning. And this is my first time writing and recording something like this, so I apologize if things are a little unclear or directionless at times. I tried to keep things somewhat focused, and I'm not really sure how that worked out. Either way, truly appreciate it if you made it this far, and thank you for watching. I have another Helldivers topic that I want to cover soon. I tried to include that into this script, but I'd already fried my brain by writing it all in one sitting, so I'll save that for another day, and hopefully I'll see you then.